Hello, so let's talk further about sound design. So today we're going to talk about oscillator interactions, and this will mostly relate to FM because, it's sort of an advanced subject, but it's also something to know about. We're also going to talk about hard sync and whatever else we can pull out of Omnisphere and Serum that are more experimental. FM is the process of changing the pitch of an oscillator over time. That's really all it is. And then there's, lots of complex interactions you can create if you have multiple oscillators, like, standard FM synthesizers like the FM8. It's using all these oscillators to create interactions that create different sounds. But just so you understand the standard way, all I'm doing is taking the wave out of my modulation oscillator. I'm going into pitch in. So we're hearing, here's oscillator 2 with nothing. Right? If we go into pitch in, what happens is right now I have my modulation going very slowly. So it's going to do this constant up and down. So in a nutshell, that's what FM is doing. It's just doing it very fast. So if we turn up our audio into an audio rate, okay, so that's how you get all those kind of bell-like sounds. This is fixed right now, but you can also make your modulation track with the keyboard, and then you get more consistent sound. And I can even set up an arpeggiator here. So what you're hearing is, the modulation oscillator really has a profound impact on what sound comes out. It's much more experimental doing it this way, so you kind of have to find the thing that works for you. Also, many synths will have a linear FM in, and what this does is essentially puts the modulation through an attenuator. So there's an offset of frequency that's happening. There's some math behind this, but the general idea is if you're just going exponentially in, just sort of into the pitch input, you're creating a much bigger frequency range that's happening. You're sort of doing addition, right? So your waves get exponentially bigger. Linear, what it does is has a little bit of an offset. In practical terms, what that means is linear is a little more tonal sounding. So you hear the difference, the going straight into pitch here, which is sort of like an exponential FM. It's really much more difficult to control, but really interesting sound. So think about it, in terms of do I want a more extreme sound or do I want a more tonal type of sound? The next thing we can talk about is hard sync. So what this does, for all intents and purposes, is adds harmonics. So if we turn up oscillator 1, right, if we put this in hard sync mode, the amount of detuning you do to oscillator 2 is going to change the harmonic content. So, for example, okay, so you hear there's a lot in there. The higher we offset the second oscillator, the brighter it gets. In practical terms, that's what you need to know. There's also some fun stuff you can do, just grandmother specific, but something you could do in general. I forget if this goes to rate in or sync in. I think it's sync in. Okay, so all I've done is I've, taken this random voltage out of the modulation oscillator and put it into pitch in. So what it's doing is just randomly detuning this oscillator, and that makes some fun results. But for all intents and purposes, hard sync, what it accomplishes is more harmonics. So that's why we're going to spend a lot of time on oscillators, because this is like your core sound that you start with. It's like you can filter a bad sound. It's still a bad sound. So you have to know where you're trying to come from. So next we're going to go into Serum and Omnisphere and take a look at those. Hello, so we're in Serum. I want to preface this with, if you want a Serum focus class or an Omnisphere focus class, let me know. The purpose of this is just to go over some general sound design principles, but as I've gone through, I've realized, some of these are so deep that there's so many options to go over. These videos could take an hour. So just let me know. I'm going to go over the main ones, especially ones that you'll probably see in other synths. For sure, we will see something like FM. So what Serum does is they provide you a warp knob, basically. It does nothing until you assign it. So we can change sync, same way that we did on the Moog. It's a sync knob, like there's hard and soft options here, but you can hear, here's our sawtooth, and we add harmonics. Just the same as on the Moog Grandmother. Something to remember is all soft synths are programmed by people that know hard synths, and so there's a lot of crossover here. Another thing that you see used a lot in Serum is these bend plus and minus, and they're just bending the waveform towards something. It depends on the actual waveform. Like here's a square wave. It's not going to move at all. Let's maybe look at a triangle wave. When you get into really complex wave shapes, this does tons of stuff too. So just be aware that bend is going to basically sort of redraw your wave shape into something else, and that's sort of like the magic of wavetables, because there's math here. Pulse width modulation is something to see, because this is a good graphical representation of what happens when we're moving this knob. We're changing where the shape of the square is happening. And normally you would attach this to some kind of oscillator, LFO or faster, and it would be doing this. That's the classic pulse width modulation sound. Let me see. So that gives you that kind of moving sound. Asymmetrical, you don't see these used as much for these purposes. We are going to skip down to FM. So you notice there's a couple different FMs. There's FM from B, FM from the noise oscillator, and FM from the sub oscillator. So let's choose FM from B, and we'll turn this, we'll go to sawtooth just to get graphically represented here. So you'll notice I turn up the knob and nothing happens. That's because this is from B, so we have to turn on the other oscillator. And then something to be aware of, let me just go to basic shapes, and we'll take a sine wave here. So you'll hear... so there's our FM happening. Something we can do too to make it stronger is to retune this oscillator. So the second oscillator... And that's sort of the magic of FM, is that, retuning the oscillators gives you a totally different result. Something to know about Serum is there's no cross modulation allowed. So in a Buchla environment, we could, send FM to A and then FM from B, we could cross these over. But you'll notice in Serum, it turns it off. So there's no cross modulation. We can't do FM on two sides at once. Another thing we can do is have FM from the noise oscillator. So if we turn on noise, and we don't even have to have it up that much. These are really noisy sounds, so just be aware of that. And Serum, like everything else with Serum, you can download lots and lots of noise profiles and even make your own. And we can also do the same thing from the sub oscillator. So if I turn on the sub... So there's our just regular shapes. We turn up FM. And, this is dependent on the type of wave shape you pick. It's also dependent on the octave of the sub and tuning of the sub oscillator. If we go way down, you'll hear we get into more LFO. Okay, so just all things to be aware of. If you are pursuing more like violent dubsteppy kinds of sounds, the recommendation I have for you is, number one, you're probably not going to use basic shapes. You're going to use something a little more exciting, but you can do this. So there's our FM. And if we turn up bend minus, this is kind of where we get our grittier sounds. Okay, so just something to be aware of. Okay, and a little volume thing. I don't know what's happening with my cables right now. And you can also add unison. Alright, so if you're pursuing like more digital sounds, this is the method. The bend minus on the B, the FM on the A, and unison mode. Okay, so let's switch over to Omnisphere and talk about that. We are back with Omnisphere. So again, we're talking more in general here, so I'm going to try to address things that are sort of across other software synths and hardware synths. So just follow along. If you don't have Omnisphere, you still might find a useful setting that exists in whatever you have. And if you want an Omnisphere specific class, just let me know. So this is the default patch, and here is just our regular kind of sawtoothy type of wave. If we click on the magnifying glass for the oscillator, you notice we get all these options. So we can transpose, we can hard sync. So that's where your hard sync is inside of Omnisphere. Symmetry and shape. It's a wavetable, so it's going to work just like Serum, those controls. And we have some samples to work with too, but we'll have to talk about that at a different time. If we go to FM, you'll see we have a few things we can control, kind of the same. We have keyboard tracking on or off. It's the same thing that I did with the Grandmother when I just plugged the keyboard tracking cable into the modulation oscillator. We can choose from tons of waveforms. So when this is on, it's basically, frequency and depth. So there's a really slow one that sounds like an LFO. And we all go up into audio rate, like regular FM. We even have a linear versus an exponential knob. That's what these are for. We can also kind of manipulate the modulation wave shapes with these knobs. So that could be interesting depending on what you've got loaded up over here as a modulator. All of this is going to be your experimentation. So that's sort of the rule of thumb for FM is, find a sound that's going to work for what you're trying to achieve. All right. Ring modulation. This may exist in other software synths. I've seen it a few other places. This is just creating sidebands. So here you have those extra harmonics. And the crazier your modulator gets, the crazier the ring modulation starts to sound. Again, just experimentation. This is sort of like a nice thing to have in digital because you can create sounds you wouldn't otherwise do. Wave shaper, think of it kind of like it'll fold the wave back on itself, but it also can just do distortion and bit crushing. There's our there's our low bit rate. So again, play with your wave shapers, see what they do. There's some great analog wave shapers from Surge that are fun. And, there's a module called the triple wave shaper, and this exists in software too. Here's your unison mode. So if you'll remember in Serum, we were like turning up voices. This is the same thing. We just turn it on. This is how we get those bigger sounds, and if we add more depth, it just gets bigger and bigger. Okay, and we can choose how far we detune it. So some really unstable sounds are possible here, which may or may not be useful to you. They're great for certain film applications and certain sort of EDM applications too. Harmonia, all this does is makes a chord. The cool thing about this is you can control the wave shape per note. So it's sort of like you start with a basic wave shape, but you can have each note have its own spin. So nice subtle things. And then the grain sampler over here, comes from the Native Instruments Absinthe. That's the first place I'm aware of it. Let me know in the comments if you've heard of it before Absinthe existed. What this does is takes the sound that's coming out of the synth and cuts it into slices and then puts them back out. There you go, you hear more grains there. Okay, so there's lots of options here. Same thing, just play around with the settings and enjoy. There's lots and lots you can do in here. You can make pitches move all over the place, and you hear it's creating bigger stereo because it's spreading the grains out all over the stereo spectrum, but you can control that with the spread knob. So yeah, there's some Eurorack modules that do this too. I have a Monsoon, which is it Beads? It's a knockoff of something else, but grain samplers are really useful. So that's it in terms of going through what you would see on this and many other synths. You're always going to find FM. Sometimes you're going to find wave shaping. You're always going to find unison. Even my OB6 has that. Are going to find grain samplers here and there. And then Serum has a lot of stuff specific to Serum, like the asymmetrical bending of the wave shape and all that stuff. But in general, hard sync symmetry, all those kinds of stuff exists. So hopefully you have somewhat of a handle on these. Like I keep saying, all of this is somewhat of an experimentation. Like I know when I move a knob what's going to happen. It's like, oh, hard sync brighter. We can get into the math of it, but it's really just hard sync brighter. And you're going to find more harmonics the higher you go, and more high harmonics. So just keep that in mind. It's all an experiment. I think the next thing we're going to talk about is envelopes, because that's sort of, oscillator is the bass sound you're starting with. It's very important. If you have a bad oscillator sound, then you're going to have a bad sound. There's not much you can do. Envelope's kind of the next step, because, how the sound starts and stops is really important in terms of what people perceive. What's the difference between strings and brass, or percussion or plucks. All of that's controlled from envelopes. So I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment if you need anything, and we'll see you on the next one.